The rain drummed on the windshield as Ruby Santos pressed her hand against her 5-month rounded belly, feeling the first pangs of a pain that wasn't merely physical. Across the mahogany desk in Caleb Montgomery's private office, the man who had sworn to love her kept his eyes fixed on the papers in front of him, unable to face her. "You need to understand my position, Ruby." His voice came out controlled, businesslike, as if he were discussing production numbers and not the future of his own child. "Anastasia and I announced our engagement yesterday. Your presence here has become complicated." Ruby felt the world tremble beneath her feet. 3 years working as an executive assistant at Montgomery Industries, 2 years as his secret mistress. And now this. Anastasia Hale, the spoiled 40-year-old stepdaughter of the company's late founder, had returned from Paris and decided Caleb would be her next trophy. Complicated. The word came out as a strangled whisper. "I'm pregnant with your child, Caleb. You promised you'd leave your wife, that we'd build a life together." For the first time, he raised his eyes. Ruby saw something there that made her take a step back. There was no regret, only cold calculation. "You signed a confidentiality agreement when we began our relationship. My lawyers are prepared to ensure you honor it." He slid a thick envelope across the desk. "There's $50,000 here. Considering your annual salary of $32,000, it's more than generous. I want you to clear your desk and leave the building by the end of the day." Ruby's hands trembled as she took the envelope. $50,000 to disappear, to raise a child alone, to erase 2 years of whispered promises and future plans she'd been foolish enough to believe. "You're a coward." The words came out firm, surprising her with her own strength. "And one day you'll regret this." Caleb had already returned his attention to the documents. "Security will escort you to the exit. Good luck, Miss Santos." An hour later, Ruby stood on the sidewalk in front of the mirrored skyscraper that housed Montgomery Industries, a cardboard box with her belongings soaking in her arms. Chicago's March storm was relentless, turning the streets into turbulent rivers. She tried to hail a cab, but 3 passed without stopping, their drivers reluctant to pick up a wet and visibly pregnant woman. The pain in her chest intensified. Ruby clutched the box against her body and started walking, tears mixing with the rain on her face. She had no family. Raised in foster homes across the Midwest, she'd learned early on not to trust promises. But Caleb had been different, or so she'd thought. He'd made her feel seen, valued, loved. What a cruel joke. Her feet carried her aimlessly through the streets of the Loop, past lit storefronts of stores she couldn't afford, past restaurants where couples dined sheltered from the downpour. The envelope in her pocket seemed to burn against her skin. $50,000. Maybe it would be enough to start over somewhere, far from Chicago, far from the memories. A violent shiver ran through her body and Ruby stumbled, the box slipping from her numb fingers and falling into the gutter. Framed photos from her time at the company scattered across the sidewalk, the glass breaking, the rainwater disfiguring images from corporate events where she'd always stayed on the sidelines, invisible except to Caleb. Damn! She knelt, trying to collect the debris, when a sudden dizziness made her sway. Her hands found the cold concrete, and she realized, with growing horror, that something was wrong. The pain in her abdomen had intensified, sharp and persistent. "No, please, not now." Her voice was lost in the roar of the storm. Headlights illuminated the street, and Ruby raised her eyes, expecting the vehicle to pass like all the others. But the car, a simple, unremarkable sedan, stopped beside her. The driver's door opened, and a man ran out toward her, not caring about the rain that immediately soaked his clothes. "My God, are you okay?" He knelt beside her, and Ruby saw a face with kind features, brown eyes full of genuine concern. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead, and he wore faded jeans and a worn work jacket. "I'm the baby." Ruby tried to explain, but another wave of pain silenced her. The man didn't hesitate. "I'll take you to the hospital. Can I help you into the car?" He lifted her with surprising strength, his grip firm but careful, and guided her to the passenger seat. Ruby was all too aware of how she must look: soaked, pathetic, falling apart. But when she looked at the man's profile as he ran to the driver's side, she saw no judgment, only determination. "Northwestern Memorial is the closest," he said, starting the engine and skillfully merging into traffic. "I'll get you there. What's your name?" "Ruby. Ruby Santos." She pressed both hands against her belly, trying to breathe through the pain. "And you?" "Foster. Foster Bennett." He gave her a quick glance, a reassuring smile curving his lips. "Hold on tight, Ruby. You and your baby are going to be okay. I promise." Promises. Ruby had learned that afternoon what promises were worth. But there was something in this stranger's voice, something in the way he drove with purpose through the storm, that made her want to believe. Northwestern Memorial Hospital appeared through the curtain of rain like a beacon. Foster stopped at the emergency entrance and, before Ruby could protest, he was already by her side, helping her out. A nurse with an umbrella appeared with a wheelchair. "How many months pregnant?" the nurse asked efficiently. 5, Ruby replied, her voice weak. "We'll take care of you, dear." The nurse started pushing her inside, but Ruby looked back, searching for Foster. He was there, standing in the rain, hands in his pockets, watching her with that same worried expression. "Thank you," she called out, the word inadequate for what she felt. He nodded. And then she was swallowed by the automatic doors, the smell of antiseptic, and the frenetic movement of the emergency room. Doctors asked questions, drew blood, connected monitors. Eventually, a middle-aged doctor with gray hair and kind eyes held her hand. "The baby is fine, Miss Santos. You had Braxton Hicks contractions, probably intensified by stress and exposure to the cold. But you're dehydrated, and we need to keep you under observation tonight." Ruby closed her eyes, allowing herself a moment of pure relief. Her baby was safe. Nothing else mattered. When she opened her eyes again, she was in a private room, the soft, late afternoon light filtering through the curtains. And sitting in the chair beside her bed, a cup of coffee cooling in his hands, was Foster Bennett. "You stayed," Ruby whispered, incredulous. He smiled, that gentle smile that seemed to light up his entire face. "Of course I stayed. Someone needed to make sure you were okay." And in that moment, wet, exhausted, heartbroken, and with an uncertain future, Ruby Santos didn't know she was looking at the man who would change her life forever. Ruby woke to the soft sound of footsteps in the hallway and the diffused morning light streaming in through the hospital window. It took a few seconds for her to get her bearings, to remember where she was and why. When the memory returned, it brought with it a wave of confused emotions: relief because her baby was fine, sadness for Caleb's betrayal, and something harder to name when her eyes met Foster Bennett still sitting in that same uncomfortable chair. He had changed clothes at some point during the night. Now he wore a simple gray t-shirt and clean jeans, but his eyes showed the fatigue of someone who hadn't slept properly. When he realized she was awake, his face lit up with that gentle smile that was already starting to become familiar. "Good morning," he said, getting up and approaching the bed. "How are you feeling?" "Better. Ruby tried to sit up, and Foster quickly adjusted the pillows behind her without her needing to ask. "You stayed here all night?" A slight blush tinged his cheeks. "I got a few hours in that chair. It's not as bad as it looks." The lie was obvious and touching. "The nurse said the doctor will come see you during morning rounds. They want to make sure you're completely stable before discharge." Ruby studied his face, looking for signs of impatience or regret for getting involved with a stranger. She found only genuine concern and something more, an old sadness that hid in the depths of those brown eyes. "Why are you doing this?" The question came out more abruptly than she intended. "You don't know me. You don't owe me anything." Foster returned to the chair, crossing his hands between his knees. For a long moment, he just looked out the window, watching Chicago's morning traffic below. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of unshared memories. 3 years ago, my younger sister was pregnant. No insurance, no support, afraid to tell the family. He paused, and Ruby saw his jaw clench. She collapsed in a subway station. Dozens of people walked past her, presuming she was just another addict. By the time someone finally stopped to help, it was already too late. We lost her and the baby. The air seemed to escape Ruby's lungs. "Foster, I'm so sorry." "So, when I saw you there in the rain, clearly in danger, there was no choice." He met her eyes, and the intensity there left her breathless. "Maybe I can't change what happened to Michelle, but I can do something different now." Before Ruby could respond, the door opened and Dr. Patricia Winters entered, bringing with her a tablet and an air of reassuring efficiency. "Good morning, Miss Santos. I see your watchful guardian is still here." She gave an approving look to Foster before turning back to Ruby. "Your vital signs are excellent. The baby is strong. But I need to ask, do you have a safe place to go? Considering what happened yesterday, exposure to extreme stress can trigger similar complications." The question hung in the air like an accusation. Ruby thought of her small apartment in Pilsen, the rent that would be due in 2 weeks, the empty refrigerator because she always ate at the company. She thought of the envelope with $50,000 that was still wet in her pocket when she arrived at the hospital. "I have an apartment," she began, but her voice failed. "That doesn't have adequate heating and is on a 4th floor with no elevator," Foster gently interjected. When Ruby stared at him in surprise, he shrugged. "I saw the address in your purse when I looked for emergency contact information. I hope you don't mind?" Dr. Winters frowned. "Miss Santos, I'm going to be frank. You need rest, adequate nutrition, and a stress-free environment for the next few days, at least. I can recommend some social assistance options, but bureaucracy can take time." "She can stay with me." Foster's words dropped like a stone into calm waters, creating ripples of shock. Ruby turned to him so sharply that the heart monitor sped up, making the nurse look with concern. "You can't be serious," Ruby whispered. Foster stood up, approaching the bed with his hands open in a gesture of sincerity. "Completely serious. I have a place in Gold Coast. 3 bedrooms. Quiet area. You can have your own space. No expectations. Just a safe place to recover and figure out your next steps." "You're a complete stranger." "Technically, we've known each other for almost 12 hours, he replied with a flicker of humor. "And I can provide references. Dr. Winters can check my background if that helps." He became serious again. "Ruby, I'm not trying to be invasive or inappropriate. I just have resources you need right now, and it would be good to have someone in the house." There was something unsaid in that last sentence, a loneliness that echoed her own. Dr. Winters observed the exchange with professional interest. her tablet forgotten. "I'll give you a few minutes to discuss," she said, heading to the door. "But, Miss Santos, you really do need a stable environment. Think carefully about your options." When they were alone, the silence stretched between them, heavy with possibilities. Ruby studied Foster Bennett, this man who had appeared at her worst moment like something out of an improbable fairy tale. He wasn't handsome in the conventional sense. His features were common, gentle rather than striking. But there was strength there, a solidity that Caleb, with all his expensive suits and polished charisma, had never possessed. "Why Gold Coast?" she finally asked. "With that car you drive and these clothes. How can you afford an apartment in one of Chicago's most expensive neighborhoods?" An enigmatic smile touched his lips. "It's a long story, but the short version is I inherited the place. As for the car and the clothes..." He looked at his faded jeans almost with affection. "Let's just say I'm doing a life experiment, trying to understand who I am outside of certain expectations." The answer was vague, but strangely Ruby found herself wanting to believe him. Perhaps it was the desperation of the situation, or perhaps it was something more fundamental, an instinct that whispered that Foster Bennett was exactly what he appeared to be. A good man trying to do something good in a world that rarely rewarded such kindness. "I have money," she said curtly. "Not much, but enough to pay rent if you accept." "I don't want your money, Ruby." "So, what do you want?" The question came out harsher than she intended, tinged with the cynicism that Caleb's betrayal had planted. Nobody does something like this without wanting something in return. Foster returned to the window, and for the first time, she saw frustration in his tense shoulders. "When Michelle died, I realized I had lived my entire life in a bubble. Protected, isolated, surrounded by people who wanted me for the wrong reasons." He turned to face her, and the vulnerability in his eyes stole her breath. "I gave all that up 6 months ago. I gave myself a year to live like an ordinary person, to find real connections, to help when I could. So yes, I want something. I want to know I can make a difference, that I can be someone my sister would be proud of." Tears burned Ruby's eyes. 24 hours ago, she had believed she knew love, that she understood human nature. Caleb had taught her how wrong she was. But this man, this kind stranger with his worn jeans and sad eyes, was offering something she barely dared to name. Trust. A second chance. A haven in the storm. 1 week, she heard herself say. "I'll stay 1 week, until I stabilize. But I'll contribute in some way. Cleaning, cooking, something. And if at any point I feel uncomfortable..." "You'll leave, no questions asked, no judgments." Foster extended his hand. "Do we have a deal?" Ruby looked at that extended hand, calloused and honest, so different from Caleb's manicured hands that had held hers while he whispered lies. She thought of the baby growing inside her, of the responsibility to protect not only herself, but the fragile life that depended on her. She took his hand, feeling the firm and warm grip. "We have a deal." Outside the window, the city continued its frantic pace, millions of lives crossing and separating in a chaotic dance. And in that hospital room, 2 strangers wounded by life's circumstances were starting something new. Not romance, not yet, but perhaps something rarer and more precious. A friendship built on honesty and mutual need, and the first promise Ruby believed could be kept. Foster Bennett's apartment wasn't what Ruby expected. When the taxi stopped in front of the elegant limestone building on North State Parkway, she presumed he would live in one of the smaller studios on the upper floors. Instead, He guided her through a marble lobby with crystal chandeliers to a private elevator that opened directly into a penthouse. "You said it was an apartment," Ruby whispered, as she stepped into a space flooded with natural light that poured in through floor-to-ceiling windows, offering panoramic views of Lake Michigan. Foster placed the small bag they had bought on the way from the hospital, the only possession Ruby had now besides her soaked clothes, next to the door. "Technically, it's an apartment. It just happens to take up the entire floor." He rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture she already recognized as a sign of discomfort. "I said it was a long story." The interior was surprisingly minimalist for such a large space. Modern furniture with clean lines, white walls decorated with black and white photographs of Chicago cityscapes, light wood floors that gleamed with the afternoon light. But there were signs of real life. A blanket carelessly thrown over the leather sofa, books stacked on the coffee table, a forgotten coffee cup on the windowsill. "The guest room is this way," Foster said, leading her down a wide hallway. He opened a door revealing a space that was larger than her entire apartment in Pilsen. The king-size bed had immaculate white bedding. There was a walk-in closet that could house 3 people's wardrobes, and a window overlooking the adjacent historic park. "The private bathroom is there," B.C. Foster pointed to another door. "Toallas are in the closet. If you need anything, my bedroom is in the other wing of the apartment. I try to keep my distance, so you feel comfortable." Ruby sat on the edge of the bed, feeling the mattress give under her weight in a way her thin, cheap mattress never did. The exhaustion of the last 24 hours finally caught up to her, but her mind refused to rest. "Foster, who are you really?" The question came out softer this time, genuine curiosity replacing suspicion. He hesitated in the doorway, his back tense. For a long moment, Ruby thought he would simply leave, keeping his secrets. Then he turned and came back into the room, sitting in the armchair near the window with a heavy sigh. "My full name is Foster Alexander Bennett. Have you heard of Bennett Capital Group?" The name hit Ruby like a shot. Of course she had heard of it. Everyone who worked in finance in Chicago knew BCG, one of the largest private investment firms in the Western Hemisphere, with assets valued in billions. She remembered seeing the name on documents that crossed Caleb's desk, always in high-level negotiations that she didn't have clearance to fully access. "Your grandfather founded the company in the 50s, she murmured, the pieces falling into place. "Your father expanded it globally in the 80s. And you—" She stared at him, seeing him with new eyes. "You're the heir. I read about you in business magazines. Always refusing interviews, avoiding the spotlight. They called you the ghost billionaire." A bitter smile touched Foster's lips. "That's me. Or was. 6 months ago, after Michelle's funeral, I realized I didn't know who I was outside the Bennett surname. Everyone around me, friends, girlfriends, business partners, wanted something. Access, connections, money." He stood up, walking to the window. "So I made a deal with my father, a year's leave of absence. I live on a modest income, without using the family name, without corporate resources. If at the end of that year I still want to give up my position, he'll respect my decision." "And what do you want?" Ruby asked softly. "Honestly, I still don't know." Foster turned to face her. "But I know what I don't want. I don't want to be the kind of man who walks past someone in danger because it's inconvenient. I don't want to live in an ivory tower so high that I forget what it's like to be human." The vulnerability in his voice resonated with something deep inside Ruby. She thought of Caleb, who lived in his own ivory tower, where people like her were disposable. where promises could be broken with a check and an NDA. So this experiment, she said slowly, is about finding authenticity. People who want you for who you are, not for what you have. Yes, and for 6 months, I failed miserably. Foster chuckled humorlessly. Turns out when you're just an ordinary guy with an ordinary job, people aren't particularly interested in you either. Funny how that works. Ruby found herself smiling despite everything. What ordinary job? A delivery driver for a medical supply company. That's how I was in that part of town yesterday. I just made a delivery when I saw you. He met her eyes. And suddenly, all those months of aimless wandering made sense. I was exactly where I needed to be. Exactly when you needed someone. The sincerity in his words disarmed Ruby's defenses. She placed a protective hand over her belly, feeling the comforting presence of her baby. You know this is insane, right? All of it. You taking me into your home? Telling me your secrets? Completely insane, Foster agreed. But maybe that's what we both need right now. A little bit of insanity, that makes sense. A comfortable silence settled between them, punctuated only by the distant sound of traffic many floors below. Ruby felt her eyelids grow heavy, the soft bed calling her to rest. You must be exhausted, Foster said, moving toward the door. I'll let you rest. There's food in the kitchen. Help yourself. And Ruby? He paused in the doorway. Welcome home, for as long as you need. Pete. After he left, closing the door softly behind him, Ruby sat on the edge of the bed, trying to process the surreal turn her life had taken. 48 hours ago, she was an executive assistant to a CEO, the secret lover of a man promised to another, naively hopeful about a future that had never existed. Now she was unemployed, single, pregnant, and living in the penthouse of a billionaire disguised as an ordinary man. She should have been terrified. She should have been planning her escape, doubting Foster's motives, building walls around her already wounded heart. Instead, she felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time. Security. Ruby stood and walked to the window, watching the lake stretch to the horizon, its surface shimmering under the afternoon sun. Somewhere out there, Caleb Montgomery was probably in yet another meeting, planning his wedding to Anastasia Hale, living his life as if Ruby had never existed. The pain of that betrayal was still sharp, but distant now, like a wound beginning to heal. Her phone vibrated. She'd left it off since being discharged from the hospital. When she turned it on, 17 messages popped up, all from unknown numbers, except one. Her heart clenched when she saw Caleb's name. Ruby, we need to talk. The lawyers are concerned you haven't signed the additional paperwork. Call me. No emotion. No concern about how she was doing or about the baby. Just another administrative task to be completed. With trembling fingers, Ruby blocked the number, then blocked all the other unknown numbers. It would be easy to react, to tell Caleb exactly what she thought of him and his twisted priorities. But Foster had said something earlier that resonated with her, about being where she needed to be when she was needed. Maybe this was her moment to stop reacting and start acting, to stop letting men like Caleb dictate her worth, to build something new not despite the ashes of her shattered relationship, but because of them. A soft knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. Ruby? Sorry to bother, but I thought you might want this. Foster entered carrying a tray, steaming soup, fresh bread, a tall glass of lemon water, and surprisingly, a small vase with a single yellow rose. You didn't have to, Ruby began, but emotion tightened her throat. I know I didn't have to. I wanted to. He set the tray on the side table. The rose was Michelle's. She always said yellow roses represented new beginnings and friendship. It seemed appropriate. Ruby picked up the delicate flower, its subtle scent filling her senses. "Thank you, Foster, for everything." He waved it off as if it were nothing, but she saw the pleasure in his eyes. "Eat. Rest. Tomorrow we can figure out the next steps together. But for today, just allow yourself to be safe." As he left again, Ruby held the yellow rose and finally allowed the tears to come. Not from sadness or despair, but from something more complex. Gratitude mingled with hope. Fear tempered with possibility. Outside, the city continued its chaotic ballet, millions of stories unfolding simultaneously. And here, in this improbable refuge above the noise, two wounded strangers began to weave their narratives together, stitch by stitch, day by day, building something fragile and precious. A friendship that could become more. A chance that could change everything. Ruby ate her soup, watching the sun begin its slow descent over the lake, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. And for the first time since she'd found out about the pregnancy, she allowed herself to imagine a future that wasn't defined by disappointment. A future where she and her baby could thrive, where promises could be kept, where a kind man in faded jeans would prove more real than any millionaire in a designer suit. A future that started now, in this exact moment, with a yellow rose and a second chance. The week Ruby had promised Foster stretched into 2, then 3. The days took on a comforting rhythm she'd never experienced before. Waking to sunlight filtering through the translucent curtains, the aroma of fresh coffee Foster always brewed before leaving for his deliveries. The quiet afternoons reading, or simply watching the lake change color with the sky. But it was in the evenings that something deeper blossomed between them. Foster would return around 6, always bringing something small. Fresh flowers from the street market, a magazine he thought she might like, ingredients for the dinner they would cook together. There was no pressure, no unspoken expectations hanging in the air. Just two people sharing space and, gradually, stories. On a rainy Tuesday in April, Ruby was in the kitchen trying to reach a bowl on the top shelf when she felt firm hands on her waist, steadying her. "Let me get that," Foster said, his voice close enough that she felt the warmth of his breath. He easily reached the bowl she'd been struggling for and placed it on the counter, but didn't immediately step away. "You shouldn't be stretching like that. What if you'd fallen?" Ruby turned, finding herself caught between the counter and his body, too close for casual comfort, but not close enough to be inappropriate. Her heart sped up in a way that had nothing to do with the exertion of reaching for the shelf. "I'm pregnant, not an invalid," she replied, but with no venom in her words. It was hard to be defensive when he looked at her with that genuine concern that made her chest tighten. "I know." His eyes scanned her face as if memorizing every detail. "But allow me to worry a little. It's one of the few privileges I have." The word privilege hung between them, loaded with meaning. Ruby saw something cross Foster's face: hesitation, desire, fear, before he stepped back, creating safe distance between their bodies. "Sorry," he murmured. "Didn't mean to invade your space." But Ruby found that she didn't want that distance. Over the past few weeks, Foster had become more than a generous host or a convenient friend. He was the first person she thought of upon waking, the presence that made the vast penthouse feel like a home, and the way her body had reacted to his proximity both scared and thrilled her in equal measure. "You didn't invade," she said softly, picking up the bowl and pretending to focus on mixing the cake batter she was preparing. In fact, I've felt strangely comfortable here. Sometimes I forget this is temporary. She felt more than saw Foster freeze behind her. When he spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. It doesn't have to be temporary. You can stay as long as you want, even after the baby is born, if that helps. Ruby paused, the wooden spoon suspended over the bowl. Foster, I can't just live off your charity forever. It's not charity. He walked to the other side of the counter, placing the marble between them like a protective barrier. It's companionship, mutual help. You've been cooking, keeping this place more alive than it has been in years. Honestly, Ruby, you're doing me a favor. Seat, she looked up to meet his eyes, searching for signs of pity or obligation. She found only sincerity and something more, a vulnerability that mirrored her own. So, what are we? The question slipped out before she could censor it. Roommates? Friends? Some weird category that doesn't have a name? Foster ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she'd learned meant he was processing something difficult. Honestly? I don't know. But I know that when I leave for work, I can't wait to come back. I know I sleep better knowing you're just across the hall. And I know the thought of you leaving. He stopped, jaw clenched. I don't like that thought. Ruby's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. All the reasons this was complicated paraded through her mind. She was still processing Caleb's betrayal. She was pregnant with another man's child. She had no job or prospects. Foster was in the midst of a personal journey that didn't include romantic complications. The list was long and logical. But there was another voice, softer and more insistent, whispering truths her mind didn't want to accept. That maybe Foster was exactly the type of man she should have always looked for. That what was growing between them was more solid than the feverish passion she'd shared with Caleb. That sometimes the best things came at the most improbable times. I don't like that idea either, she admitted in a low voice. The relief that flooded Foster's face was evident and touching. He walked around the counter, stopping a respectful but not distant space away. Then, let's not think about it now. Let's just see where this goes. No pressure, no expectations. Just the two of us figuring things out together. Ruby nodded, turning her attention back to the batter that now desperately needed more attention, but her thoughts were anywhere but on the cake. She was in dangerous territory, and she knew it. To allow herself to feel something for Foster, to trust again after Caleb, to open her heart when it was still patching its cracks. It was reckless at best, self-destructive at worst. But when Foster picked up the second bowl and started helping her without being asked, their shoulders occasionally brushing as they worked side by side, Ruby found that she didn't care about prudence. For the first time since she'd discovered her pregnancy, she felt less alone in the world. That night, after dinner, and watching a documentary about Chicago architecture that Foster had insisted she would love. And he was right. Ruby was getting ready for bed when her phone rang. An unknown number, but not one she had blocked. Against her better judgment, she answered. Ruby Santos? A feminine voice, refined and cold as polished ice. Who is this? Anastasia Hale. Well, soon to be Anastasia Montgomery. A loaded pause. I understand you and Caleb had an understanding. He mentioned there were unresolved issues. Ruby gripped the phone hard enough for her knuckles to turn white. I have nothing to say to you. How convenient, because I didn't call to chat. I called to clarify your position. The venom in Anastasia's voice was almost palpable. Caleb told me about the baby, about how you tried to trap him with a pregnancy. It's quite pathetic, really. Anger ignited hot and fierce in Ruby's chest. He said that I tried to trap him? Among other things. But don't worry, darling. I completely understand. A girl like you, from your background, seeing an opportunity to secure financial stability through a wealthy man. Anastasia laughed, the sound like breaking glass. But you chose the wrong man. Caleb is mine now, and I have resources you can't even imagine to ensure he stays that way. I don't want Caleb, Ruby said, her voice surprisingly steady, despite the tremor in her hands. You can have him, and you're welcome to him. Ah, but there's the matter of that baby. A Montgomery bastard running around could become inconvenient in the future. So I'm prepared to make an offer. $500,000. You sign an agreement giving up all parental rights, never mention Caleb as the father, and disappear. The world tilted beneath Ruby's feet. $500,000. 10 times what Caleb had offered. Enough money to start over anywhere, to give her baby a stable life away from all this drama. Enough money to sell her child. Go to hell, Ruby whispered, the line already dead before Anastasia could reply. She was trembling so violently that she dropped the phone, the sound of it clattering on the hardwood floor, echoing in the silent room. Nausea rose in her throat, not the pregnancy-related kind, but the pure moral revulsion of knowing what man he had chosen over her and their child. A man so weak he would let his fiancée offer money to make an inconvenient problem disappear. A knock on the door made her heart jump. Ruby? I heard something fall. Are you okay? Foster. Of course he would have heard. Of course he would care. I'm fine, she called out, but her voice betrayed the lie. The door opened a crack, and Foster peeked in, already dressed for bed in sweatpants and a worn t-shirt. When his eyes met hers and saw whatever was plastered on her face, he crossed the room without hesitation, kneeling before her where she sat on the edge of the bed. What happened? His hands found hers, steady and warm. Are you hurt? Not physically. The words came out choked. It was Caleb's fiancée, Anastasia. She offered $500,000 for me to give up my parental rights and disappear. Foster's jaw clenched, anger crossing his usually gentle features. That's despicable. The worst part is for a second. Just one stupid, brief second. I considered it. Ruby felt the tears burn. Not to accept. I could never do that. But $500,000, Foster. It's more money than I'll ever see. It could give my baby everything I never had. You know what your baby needs more than money? Foster asked softly, his hands squeezing hers. A mother who loves him enough to refuse $500,000. A mother strong enough to say no when every survival instinct is screaming to say yes. The tears she'd been holding back finally spilled over. Foster pulled her into his arms without hesitation, one hand stroking her hair as she cried against his shoulder. For everything she'd lost, for everything Caleb had proven to be, for the innocent child caught in the middle of this mess. You're not alone, Foster murmured against her hair. I know we're still figuring out what this is between us, but you're not alone. You never will be again, if I can help it. Ruby clung to him, allowing herself to absorb his strength, his warmth, his absolute solidity. And there, safe in the circle of his arms, something shifted within her. Not love, not yet. It was too soon, too complicated to put that name to it. But trust, hope, the growing belief that maybe Foster Bennett wasn't too good to be true. Maybe he was simply good. And maybe, just maybe, she deserved exactly that after all. Sunday morning arrived with an unusual quiet in the penthouse. Ruby woke late, the light already high filtering through the curtains, and for a moment she allowed herself to simply lie there, one hand resting on her belly, where her baby grew more noticeable each day. 6 months now. Halfway through this journey that had begun in betrayal and tears, but had transformed into something completely unexpected. She could hear sounds coming from the kitchen, the clinking of pots, the aroma of something delicious being prepared. Foster must have been up early again. He did that on weekends, created elaborate breakfasts, as if making up for the simple meals they shared during the week. Ruby smiled at the ceiling, feeling that familiar warmth spread through her chest whenever she thought of him. 4 months of living together had created an intimacy that went beyond the romantic. They knew each other's habits, how Foster always left a cup of chamomile tea for her before bed, how Ruby compulsively reorganized his books by color instead of by author, irritating him in a way he pretended to complain about, but secretly adored. Small rituals that wove their lives together, stitch by stitch. When Ruby entered the kitchen wearing one of the soft robes Foster had insisted on buying for her, she found him at the stove, flipping pancakes with intense concentration. He wore a dark green t-shirt that accentuated the muscles in his back, muscles she'd been noticing more and more lately, and his hair was adorably messy. "Good morning," she said, and watched as he turned with a smile that lit up his entire face. "Good morning. I thought I'd make something special today." He gestured to the table where fresh strawberries, whipped cream, orange juice, and what looked like perfectly crisp bacon were already laid out. "We have reason to celebrate." Ruby sat down, curious. "We do?" Foster turned off the stove and brought over a golden stack of pancakes, sitting beside her instead of across the table, as he used to do in the first few months. This slight adjustment in physical distance had happened gradually, naturally, until now it felt strange when they weren't close. "It's been 4 months since you arrived here," he said, his dark eyes fixed on hers, "and I wanted to ask you something. Actually, propose something." Ruby's heart quickened. "Propose?" "Not like that," Foster chuckled, but there was a nervousness in his fingers that drummed on the table. "Not yet, at least. But my year of experiencing a normal life ends in 2 months, and I have a decision to make about returning to Bennett Capital or pursuing another path." Ruby felt her stomach clench. She had avoided thinking about it, about what would happen when Foster's time was up, and he had to return to the world of billions and corporate expectations, a world where a pregnant ex-executive assistant probably wouldn't fit in. "And have you decided?" She kept her voice calm, but her hands betrayed her anxiety, clutching the napkin in her lap. Foster covered her hands with his, that simple touch sending waves of warmth through her arms. "I've decided I don't want to make that decision alone. Ruby, these 4 months have been the best of my life, not because I gave up the money or the name, but because I met you, because we've built something real here." He paused, and Ruby saw raw vulnerability in his eyes. "So, I'm proposing this. Come with me to meet my family. My father is turning 65 in 2 weeks at our estate in Lake Forest. It's time to stop hiding who I am, to stop living in this bubble, and I want you by my side when I do it." The request was simple, but the implications were monumental. Meeting the Bennett family would mean entering Foster's world for real, not just the man in faded jeans who drove a delivery truck, but the heir to a financial empire. It would mean scrutiny, judgment, and possibly rejection. "Foster, your family will hate me," Ruby said softly. "I'm pregnant with another man's child. I have no pedigree, no important family, nothing that people like the Bennetts value. You have something none of those people have, Foster replied with intensity. You are real. You're kind without needing to be, strong when it would be easier to fall apart, and you see me for who I am, and not the last name I carry. He slid closer, his knee brushing hers. My father can be intimidating, and my mother definitely has strong opinions, but Michelle would have loved you, and that means something. The mention of Foster's deceased sister brought tears to Ruby's eyes. He spoke of Michelle often, sharing memories that kept her presence alive between them. Ruby felt like she knew the girl. Her loud laugh, her passion for social justice, her heart too big for the cruel world that eventually consumed her. Are you sure? Ruby asked, allowing herself to absorb the hope that bloomed in her chest. Because once we take this step, there's no going back. Your world will know about me, about the baby. And what if they try to separate us? Foster raised a hand to her face, his thumb tracing the line of her cheek with a tenderness that stole her breath. Then we'll fight together. Ruby, I want to build a future with you. I don't know exactly what it will look like, whether I'll go back to the company or start something new, whether we'll stay in Chicago or move. But I know I want you in it. You and your baby. The words hung between them, heavy with possibility. Ruby thought about how far she had come since that rainy night when Foster had found her broken on the sidewalk. He had helped her rebuild not just her material stability, but her belief that good men existed, that love didn't have to come with conditions and non-disclosure agreements. Our baby, she heard herself say, testing the words. If we're going to do this, if we're going to build something real, then it's not my baby. It's ours. The emotion that crossed Foster's face was overwhelming. His eyes shone with unshed tears as he pressed his forehead against hers, their breaths mingling in the tiny space between them. Our baby, he repeated, voice hoarse. Ruby Santos, you just gave me the greatest gift. They remained like that for a long moment, suspended in a bubble of intimacy that made the vast penthouse feel cozy. Then Foster pulled back slightly, reaching for something in his pocket. There's one more thing. He opened his hand, revealing an old brass key tied to a velvet ribbon. My grandparents had a cabin in Door County, Wisconsin. It's been empty most of the year since my grandmother passed away. I thought we could go there for a few days before my father's birthday. Just the two of us, away from the city, away from everything. A place to breathe and plan our next move. Ruby took the key, feeling its weight in her palm. When would we leave? Tomorrow, if you like. I can take a few days off work. Foster grinned mischievously. One of the perks of being a regular delivery driver is that no one really cares when you ask for time off. The idea of escaping, of having Foster all to herself in a peaceful place, away from the complications of their lives, was too tempting to resist. Ruby nodded, returning his smile. Let's do it, but under one condition. Anything. Stop pretending that making pancakes isn't completely stressful for you. I saw you check that recipe on your phone 3 times. Foster chuckled, the rich, genuine sound that always made her heart skip. Good point. Cooking is definitely not my natural talent, but I'm trying. I know, and that makes it even more special. Ruby reached for a pancake, tearing off a piece and finding it was, surprisingly, perfect. Foster. Yes? I'm scared. The admission came out in a whisper. I'm scared of letting you in completely, of building my life around something that could disappear. Caleb taught me that promises are fragile. Foster turned his chair to face her completely, taking both her hands in his. I understand that fear, and I won't lie and say I promise never to hurt or disappoint you, because I'm human and I will make mistakes. But I promise you this, I will show up every day. I will choose you every day. And when things get tough, I won't run away with a check and a non-disclosure agreement. I'll stay and we'll work it out together. The tears Ruby had been holding back finally fell, but they were tears of relief and hope more than sadness. She squeezed Foster's hands, anchored by his steady presence. So, let's go to Door County, she said. Let's meet your family, and let's figure out how to build this impossible future together. Foster pulled her into an embrace that enveloped her completely, his body solid and warm against hers. Ruby allowed herself to melt into his arms, feeling for the first time that maybe it was okay to trust again, to believe again. When they finally pulled apart, breakfast had grown cold, but neither of them cared. They ate lukewarm pancakes while Foster described the cabin, its location by the water, the sunsets that painted the sky violet and gold, the forest trails where his grandmother used to walk every morning. Ruby listened, imagining a future that included not just survival, but real happiness. A future where the baby growing inside her would have not only a mother who loved him, but a complete family. Where she herself could finally belong somewhere, with someone. Later that day, as they packed for the trip, Ruby found the yellow rose Foster had given her at the hospital months ago. She had pressed it between the pages of a book, preserving its meaning, new beginnings and friendship. But looking at it now, Ruby realized it had evolved beyond those simple words. What she felt for Foster Bennett was not just friendship, and the beginning they shared was not new, but rather the continuation of something that had started on that rainy night when a kind stranger decided to stop. It was love, complicated, terrifying, wonderful love that had grown slowly and deeply like tree roots, intertwining their lives in ways that couldn't be easily undone. And for the first time since her world had crumbled in that mahogany office, Ruby Santos allowed herself to believe that maybe she deserved exactly that. The cabin in Door County was exactly as Foster had described. A stone and wood cottage nestled among century-old pine trees, with a wide deck that stretched toward Lake Michigan. Ruby stood on the gravel path as Foster opened the door, breathing in the fresh air scented with pine and lake water, feeling something inside her relax for the first time in months. "Come," Foster said, holding out his hand. "I want to show you my favorite spot before it gets dark." She intertwined her fingers with his, allowing herself to be guided through the house with its rustic and cozy interior. Exposed beams, a stone fireplace, wide windows that captured the afternoon light. Foster didn't stop for the full tour, instead leading her directly through the French doors to the deck. And there it was. The lake stretched infinitely before them, its surface shimmering golden under the low sun. A narrow trail descended the slope to a private beach, where gentle waves lapped at the sand. "It's perfect," Ruby whispered, and felt Foster squeeze her hand. "I used to come here with Michelle when we were kids. She said this was the only place where she could really think, where the world didn't feel so loud." His voice carried a sweet and bitter nostalgia. "I think I understand what she meant now." They walked down to the beach, Ruby stepping carefully over the uneven stones with Foster's hand steady at her waist. The wind blew stronger near the water, bringing the fresh, clean scent of the lake. Ruby took off her shoes, allowing her toes to sink into the cool sand. "Can I ask you something?" she said, watching the waves approach and recede in a hypnotic rhythm. "Anything." You mentioned Michelle died 3 years ago, but what was it really like? You don't have to answer if it's too difficult. Foster was silent for so long that Ruby thought she had crossed a line. Then he sat down on the sand, pulling her down beside him, his body blocking the wind for her. Michelle was 23, a social work student at Northwestern. She was passionate, you know? Saw injustice everywhere and had to fix it. It was exhausting and inspiring at the same time. He picked up a handful of sand, letting it sift through his fingers. She was dating a guy, Tyler. He seemed good at first, but he was controlling. Isolated her from friends, then from family. When she found out she was pregnant, he disappeared. Just vanished. Ruby pressed closer to him, listening without interrupting. Michelle was ashamed to tell us. Our parents have certain expectations, certain standards. She thought she would disappoint us. Foster's voice broke. So she tried to cope on her own. Worked 2 jobs, attended classes, hid her pregnancy with loose clothing. Her body just couldn't handle the stress. She collapsed in that subway station one December morning. People assumed she was just another homeless person. By the time paramedics finally arrived, both she and the baby were already gone. Tears rolled freely down Ruby's face now. She understood with painful clarity why Foster had stopped to help her that rainy night, why he had opened his home without hesitation. She was the second chance he never got with Michelle. "I'm so sorry," she murmured, inadequate but sincere. The worst part was finding out afterward that she had sent us messages, called several times in that last month. But I was busy with mergers and acquisitions, flying to Tokyo and London, ignoring calls because I assumed she just wanted to chat. Foster finally looked at Ruby, and the raw guilt in his eyes broke her heart. I could have saved her if I had just answered the phone. "No," Ruby said firmly, turning his face to meet hers. "You couldn't have saved her from a system that fails women like us every day, from a society that teaches shame instead of support, from the man who abandoned her when she needed him most. You could have been there, yes, but it's not your fault." Something shifted in Foster's face, as if he were hearing those words for the first time in a way that truly resonated. He pulled Ruby into his arms, holding her with a strength that bordered on desperation. "You're incredible. You know that?" he murmured against her hair. "You somehow went through your own betrayal and abandonment, but you still have compassion to offer." "I learned from the best," Ruby replied, allowing herself to melt against him. They sat like that as the sun dipped, painting the sky in layers of pink and orange that reflected on the water like a living canvas. Ruby felt the baby stir inside her, a gentle reminder of the life she carried, of the future she was building. "Foster," she said eventually, "I need to tell you something. About Caleb." She felt him tense slightly, but he didn't pull away. "I'm listening. I never told you the full story. Why I believed him. Why I was foolish enough to think a man like him actually loved me." Ruby took a deep breath, preparing to expose old wounds. "I grew up in the foster care system, moving from house to house throughout Michigan and Illinois. I never stayed in one place for more than 2 years. I learned early not to get attached, not to trust promises of forever." Foster rubbed slow circles on her back, a silent comfort that encouraged her to continue. "When I got the job at Montgomery Industries at 23, it was my first real job, my first chance at real stability. Caleb noticed me early on, but kept a professional distance for months. Then, one night, working late on an audit report, he brought me dinner. We talked. He seemed so interested in my life, in my dreams. She laughed bitterly. Obviously, now I see he was testing my vulnerability, looking for the hooks he could use. He's a predator, Foster said softly. Men like him can sense people who long to belong to someone. They use that as a weapon. Exactly. Our relationship started slowly, secretly. He said his wife didn't understand him, that they were only together for appearances, that he was just waiting for the right time to ask for a divorce. Ruby clenched her fists. Every classic line, and I believed every word. Because when you've spent your whole life without someone choosing you, and suddenly a powerful, successful man says you're special, you want to believe so badly that you ignore all the red flags. And then you found out about the baby. And then I found out about the baby. Ruby placed her hand over her belly. I thought he'd be happy. I thought it would be the reason he needed to finally leave his wife. Instead, he left his wife for Anastasia and offered me money to disappear, as if I were just another business expense to be handled. Foster turned her to face him, his hands cupping her face with infinite tenderness. Ruby Santos, you listen to me. You were never disposable. Never just an expense. And any man foolish enough not to see your worth doesn't even deserve to breathe the same air as you. The intensity in his eyes stole Ruby's breath. She saw her own reflection there, saw how he looked at her. Not with pity or obligation, but with genuine respect, and something deeper that made her heart race. How do you do that? She whispered. How do you make me feel like maybe I really am worthy of something good? Because you are, and I'll spend every day proving it to you if you let me. Foster leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. Ruby, I know we promised to take things slow, no pressure, but I need you to know, this isn't charity. It's not guilt over Michelle. It's you, wholly and completely you. Ruby's heart beat so hard she was sure he could feel it. Foster, You don't have to say anything yet, he interrupted gently. I just needed you to know. When you meet my family, when we re-enter that world, I want you to understand that you're not a guest I'm bringing. You're my partner, my person. And if they can't see how extraordinary you are, then they don't deserve to know you. Tears streamed freely now, but they were tears of liberation, of finally allowing herself to believe that maybe she deserved exactly that. Ruby closed the small distance between them, pressing her lips against his in a kiss that held months of building tension, of unspoken feelings, of cautious hope finally allowed to blossom. Foster responded with equal but gentle urgency, his hands moving to her hair, deepening the kiss as she pressed closer despite her rounded belly. The world narrowed to just the two of them, to the salty taste of tears and possibility, to the sound of the waves providing a soundtrack for this moment that would change everything. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless and trembling, Foster rested his forehead against hers again, a smile touching his lips. Worth the wait, he murmured, and Ruby laughed through her tears. Yes, it was. They stayed on the beach until the stars began to appear, talking about everything and nothing, plans for the baby, fears about meeting the Bennett family, childhood memories that shaped who they were. When the cold finally drove them back inside, Foster built a fire in the fireplace, while Ruby explored the kitchen, finding ingredients for a simple dinner. They cooked together, moving around each other with the practical ease of people who had shared space long enough to know each other's rhythms. Foster chopped vegetables while Ruby seasoned chicken, their conversations punctuated by casual touches and stolen smiles that had a different quality, now that they had finally admitted what was growing between them. After dinner, they sat on the sofa before the fire, Ruby's body nestled against Foster's, his hand resting on her belly where the baby occasionally kicked. "Did you feel that?" Ruby asked, when a particularly strong kick startled them. "I did." The wonder in Foster's voice made her turn to look at him. "It's amazing. There's actually a tiny person in there." "A tiny person who's determined to use my bladder as a punching bag," Ruby said dryly, and Foster chuckled. "Can I say something that might be premature?" he asked after a moment. "After that kiss on the beach, I'm not sure what counts as premature." Foster smiled. "Fair enough. So, I want to be this child's father. Not biologically, obviously, but in all the ways that matter. I want to be in the delivery room. I want sleepless nights and diaper changes. I want first steps and words and school days. I want all of it, if you'll let me." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Ruby thought of Caleb, who had discarded this child before it was even born. She thought of all the temporary homes of her childhood, how desperately she had wished for someone who would choose to stay. And here was Foster Bennett, offering exactly that, not because he was obligated, not out of guilt or pity, but simply because he wanted to, because he saw value where Caleb had seen only inconvenience. "Yes," Ruby whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Foster. I want that too." He pulled her closer, and they stayed like that for hours, watching the fire dance as they planned a future that 2 months ago would have seemed impossible. They talked about names for the baby, about what it would be like to decorate the third bedroom as a nursery, about whether they should stay in Chicago or consider moving somewhere quieter. "Meeting your family terrifies me," Ruby admitted eventually. "It terrifies me a little, too," Foster confessed. "My father has certain expectations. He always assumed I'd marry someone from our social circle, someone who understood the business world. Not a woman pregnant with another man's child, whom I've only known for 4 months. When you put it like that, it sounds absolutely insane. The best things usually are." Foster kissed the top of her head. "But Ruby, no matter what happens with my family, no matter what my father says about going back to the company or forging my own path, you and this baby are my priority now. I won't let anyone make you feel inferior or unworthy, not even my own parents." The promise settled something within Ruby, an anxiety she hadn't even realized she was carrying. For the first time since Foster had mentioned his father's birthday, she felt that maybe she could face the Bennetts. Not because she was strong enough on her own, but because she wouldn't be alone. She would have Foster by her side, and that made all the difference. Later that night, as they parted ways for their separate rooms, Foster paused at her door. "Sleep well," he said softly. "And Ruby, thank you." "For what?" "For letting me in, for trusting me when every reason said not to, for being you." He smiled, that smile that transformed his entire face. "For making me believe in possibilities again." After he left, Ruby stood by the window, watching the moonlight dance on the Bennett estate in Lake Forest was even more imposing than Ruby had imagined. Wrought iron gates opened onto an avenue lined with centuries-old oaks, leading to a Tudor-style mansion that looked as if it had been transported directly from Victorian England. When Foster parked the car, not the modest sedan he'd driven that rainy night, but a BMW convertible that clearly belonged in this world of privilege, Ruby felt her stomach clench. "Breathe," Foster murmured, his hand finding hers over the console. "They're just people, difficult, and sometimes impossible people. But still, just people." Ruby nodded, but her hands trembled as she smoothed the navy blue maternity dress that Foster had insisted on buying for the occasion. 7 months pregnant now, her prominent belly impossible to hide or ignore. Every person at this party would know immediately that she was carrying a child, and Ruby felt the weight of the judgment that would come. A valet appeared as they exited the car, and Ruby watched Foster hand over the keys with an ease that revealed how natural this world was to him. How many times had he been here before, wearing expensive suits and smiling at people who only saw his last name? Who was the real Foster Bennett? The man in faded jeans who had brought her yellow roses? Or this polished heir navigating his inheritance with poise? "My parents will be in the backyard," Foster said, guiding her through double doors that opened into a marble foyer with a crystal chandelier that probably cost more than Ruby's entire annual salary at Montgomery Industries. "My father's birthday always follows the same pattern. Cocktails at 3, dinner at 6, torturous speeches at 8. His attempt at humor didn't disguise the tension in his shoulders. Ruby squeezed his hand, offering silent support as they walked through corridors adorned with portraits of generations of Bennetts. Serious men in dark suits, elegant women in period dresses, all looking down with expressions Ruby couldn't decipher. Judgment? Expectation? Disappointment with descendants who failed to meet their impossible standards? The backyard garden was a meticulously landscaped expanse of green lawns and flower beds, where dozens of guests circulated with champagne flutes and polite conversation. Ruby recognized some faces from business magazines: CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, heirs to old fortunes, the kind of people who moved markets with casual phone calls. And there, at the center of it all, was a man who could only be Alexander Bennett. He was taller than Foster, with gray hair cut with military precision, and piercing blue eyes that Ruby felt assessing and categorizing her the moment they entered the garden. Beside him was a woman of glacial beauty, in a cream Chanel dress, platinum blonde hair pulled back in an impeccable bun. Clearly, Foster's mother. "Foster," Alexander Bennett said, his voice carrying an authority that commanded attention without raising its volume. "You finally decided to show up, and you brought a guest." There was no warmth in the remark, just a factual statement tinged with something Ruby couldn't identify. Foster kept his hand firmly entwined with hers as he led them closer to his parents. "Father, Mother, this is Ruby Santos. Ruby, my parents, Alexander and Victoria Bennett." Victoria extended a hand with perfectly manicured nails, her grip brief and cold. "Miss Santos, what a surprise to meet you. Foster mentioned very little about recent developments in your life." The word developments hung in the air like a veiled accusation, Victoria's eyes briefly dropping to Ruby's belly before flicking away with polite disapproval. "It's a pleasure to meet you," Ruby managed to say, keeping her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. "Thank you for having me in your home." "Of course." Alexander studied Foster with uncomfortable intensity. "Son, we need to talk. There are matters concerning your return to the company that require immediate discussion." "Later," Foster replied, his voice polite but unyielding. "Today is your birthday, Father. Let's enjoy the party first." Something passed between father and son, a silent battle of wills that Ruby felt more than saw. Alexander then nodded curtly, turning to greet other guests, but not before casting a final assessing glance at Ruby that made her feel utterly exposed. "That went well," Foster murmured ironically as they walked away. "At least, no one's kicked you out yet." "The day isn't over yet," Ruby replied, but her attempt at humor sounded forced even to her own ears. The next 2 hours were a blur of introductions to people whose names Ruby instantly forgot, polite smiles that didn't reach speculative eyes, and courteous conversations that halted abruptly when she approached. The women were particularly cruel in their subtlety. Remarks about how Ruby was radiant despite difficult circumstances. Pointed questions about her origins and professional experience. Foster remained by her side like a protective shield, redirecting conversations when they grew uncomfortable, his hand never leaving hers. But Ruby saw the toll on his face, the tension around his eyes, the clenched jaw as he navigated this world that clearly suffocated him. It was during a rare moment of solitude, Foster had gone to fetch her some water, that Anastasia Hale appeared like a nightmare apparition. She was even more striking in person than Ruby had imagined from the online photos. Tall, blonde, wearing a red ensemble that probably cost more than 3 months' rent for Ruby's old apartment. Her features were aristocratic, classic in a way Ruby knew she could never achieve. And the eyes that met Ruby's were filled with pure malice. "So, you're the little opportunist Foster picked up," Anastasia said, her voice a soft purr designed to sound civilized but carrying deadly venom. "I must admit, when Caleb told me about your new arrangement, I was fascinated. What a clever maneuver, moving from one rich man to an even richer one." Ruby felt her blood run cold. "What are you doing here?" "My family has done business with the Bennetts for decades, darling. We're always at the same social events." Anastasia smiled, the gesture not reaching her eyes. "Caleb is here too, by the way. Right over there talking to Congressman Williams. Perhaps you should say hello to him. I'm sure he'd be delighted to see how you've recovered from your mishap." The world tilted beneath Ruby's feet. She spun around, following Anastasia's gaze to where a group of suited men was chatting near the ornamental fountain. And there, as if he had been conjured from Ruby's worst nightmares, was Caleb Montgomery. He looked exactly as he had the last time she'd seen him. Dark hair perfectly combed, Armani suit that emphasized his broad shoulders, that confident smile she had once found irresistible but now saw as a predator's disguise. When his eyes met hers across the crowded garden, something flickered across his face. Surprise, perhaps a flash of guilt, before his charming mask recomposed itself. He said something to the men he was talking with and began to walk towards Ruby and Anastasia, each step deliberate and measured. Ruby's heart pounded so hard she could barely breathe, all the wounds she thought had healed tearing open again. "Ruby," Caleb said when he reached them, his voice that familiar blend of charm and authority she had once responded to so easily. "You look well. Pregnancy suits you." The words were kind, but Ruby heard the calculating assessment beneath them. He was measuring her worth, assessing if she posed a threat, deciding his strategy exactly as he would in a corporate negotiation. "Don't talk to me," Ruby managed to say, her voice firmer than she expected. "You have no right." "Now, let's be civil," Anastasia interjected, her arm sliding possessively through Caleb's. "After all, we're all among friends here." And Ruby must be eager to share how she managed her upgrade, from rejected executive assistant to Foster Bennett's arm in just a few months. Quite impressive. The implication was clear, drawn with deliberate intent. Ruby saw some nearby guests slow their conversations, ears adjusting to catch this unfolding drama. She felt the weight of their judgments, their presumptions about who she was and what she wanted. "You know nothing about me or about Foster," Ruby said, refusing to back down despite her trembling hands. "And frankly, what you or Caleb think ceased to matter the moment you offered me money to erase my child's existence." Caleb had the decency to look uncomfortable, but Anastasia merely laughed. "Oh, yes, that generous offer you so nobly refused. Though now I see you were merely holding out for a better bid. Foster Bennett is worth considerably more than $500,000. Enough." The voice cut through the garden like a whip, and everyone turned to see Foster walking towards them with an expression Ruby had never seen before. Cold, controlled anger that transformed his usually gentle features into something formidable. "Miss Hale, Mr. Montgomery, I strongly suggest you step away from Ruby before you say something you regret." Foster stopped beside Ruby, his hand finding her waist in a protective gesture that left no doubt where his loyalty lay. Foster. What a pleasure! Anastasia purred, but Ruby saw her calculating gaze assessing the situation. "I was just getting to know your new companion. What a fascinating story she has, and one that is none of your business," Foster retorted. "In fact, I'd appreciate it if you both left my family alone. Your presence here is a courtesy based on business connections my father maintains, but it does not authorize you to harass my guests." Caleb finally spoke, his voice carrying that condescending tone Ruby had once mistaken for authority. "Bennett, perhaps you don't fully understand the situation. Ruby and I have a complicated history, and there are legal matters concerning the child she carries. You should consider carefully before getting involved in—" "The child she carries?" Foster interrupted, his voice dangerously calm. "You mean the child who will be born in 2 months. The child I hear about every night when Ruby tells me about every kick, every hiccup? The child for whom we've set up a nursery and chosen names together?" He took a step closer to Caleb, forcing the older man to back away. "That child is not a legal matter or a problem to be managed. That is a person I will love and protect as if they were my own flesh and blood. So, any rights you think you have ended when you offered dirty money to make Ruby disappear." The silence that followed was absolute. Ruby was aware of dozens of eyes on them, conversations halting completely as everyone watched this public confrontation. She saw Alexander and Victoria Bennett approaching from the periphery of the crowd, their expressions unreadable. Caleb opened his mouth, clearly preparing to retaliate, but Anastasia placed a hand on his arm. "Let's go, darling," she said, her voice icy with ill-concealed anger. "Clearly we're not welcome here." She cast one last poisonous look at Ruby. "Enjoy it while it lasts. Men like Foster Bennett don't build futures with women like you. You're a diversion, a phase. Eventually, he'll return to his world, and you'll be exactly where you started." They walked away, but Anastasia's words lingered, planting seeds of doubt that Ruby knew would grow if she allowed them to. She was trembling now, the adrenaline that had sustained her during the confrontation evaporating and leaving exhaustion in its wake. Foster turned to her, his hands framing her face with infinite tenderness. "Are you okay? I'm so sorry. I didn't see them coming until it was too late." "I'm fine," Ruby whispered, but they both knew it was a lie. "Foster, maybe she's right. Maybe I don't belong in this world. These people, their expectations." "No," Foster said firmly. "Don't let her venom get to you. Ruby, look at me." She raised her eyes to meet his, seeing fierce determination there. "I choose you, not out of rebellion, not as a statement against my family or this lifestyle. I choose you because you make me want to be better, because your strength inspires me, because I can't imagine a future without you in it." Before Ruby could respond, Alexander Bennett appeared beside them, Victoria following a step behind. His face was unreadable as he studied his son and the woman beside him. "I think we need to have that conversation now," Alexander said, his voice neutral. "Foster, Miss Santos, please accompany me to my study. There are matters that require immediate clarification." Alexander Bennett's study was exactly what Ruby would expect. Dark, wood-paneled walls, first editions on bookshelves, a mahogany desk that likely cost more than a luxury car. He sat behind it like a judge behind a bench, fingers interlaced as he studied Foster and Ruby sitting across from him. Victoria remained standing by the window, her perfect posture revealing decades of refined etiquette. When she spoke,